Hello, Martina Gormley is my name. I'm a dairy specialist working with Teagasc based in Athenry in Galway. Today I'm going to be going through analysis from 1 year's milk recording data, where we looked at milking times and their effects in relation to the length of the working day. The reason for this analysis came from surveys with dairy farm employees, where it was evident that the length of the working day on some dairy farms, and in particular the finish time in the evening, was, I suppose, becoming a challenge or an obstacle maybe in terms of working on some dairy farms. So when we look at the average data, which came from nearly 9,000 herds, milk records from 2,366 farms, which was on average 4 milk recordings per farm. We can see that the average herd size is 118 cows, with a big range, anything from 40 cows all the way up to over 600 cows. And when we look at milk kgs per cow per day, the average was 23. Again, depending on the time of the year, before dry off, the minimum was 8, and the maximum for the higher output herds at peak was 42 kgs per cow per day. In terms of the milking start time in the morning, the average was 7:30. Now, this doesn't include bringing in the cows. Okay, so it's the actual start time of when the machine was turned on. But there's a big range, with some farms starting at 5 o'clock and others milking later in the day after 11 o'clock. The finish time was an hour and a half later, and again, a big variation depending on the start time. In terms of the evening milking, the average evening milking time was nearly 5:15, with some farms starting at 3 o'clock and others going on late in the evening up to 9 o'clock at night, starting milking. The finish time then was in the evening was an hour and a half later. Again, a big variation, with some farms finished milking at 20 to 5 and others were after 11 o'clock at night. So the finish time here doesn't include washing down the parlour or locking away the cows. So it's when the last meter was turned off. In terms of the hours spent milking, 3 hours was the average here, with a big variation depending on the number of rows of cows going through the parlour. The milking interval, which is the time the first cluster goes on in the morning to the time that the first cluster goes on again in the evening, was on average 10 hours. The target is 8 hours, for example, which would be a farmer starting at 7 in the morning and again at 3 in the afternoon. So that would be an 8-hour milking interval. Big range with this cohort of farmers, anything from 7 hours of a milking interval, which would be 7 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, up to a 15-hour milking interval. The length of the working day was nearly 12 hours on average, with some farms 8.5 hours and others over 16 hours. That doesn't take into account breaks or non-farming activity. So when we looked at then milking interval and its relationship with the length of the working day, we found that there was a really strong relationship, and that 71% of the variation in the length of the working day is down to a milking interval, which really is in the evening time. When do you press the on button in the machine? And we can see clearly from the scatter plot here that there's an upward trend. So as your milking interval increases and you push out your evening milking, so too does your length of the day. So really what this is telling us, if we want to shorten our working day or get, I suppose, the most important task, which is the milking, done early, we really need to go after the milking interval. Also, we can see that the length of the working day increases by 1 hour for every extra hour spent or every extra hour that the milking interval increases. So again, that's just showing that there's a really strong correlation here. So I suppose a common perception is that if I reduce my milking interval and start milking earlier in the evening, I'm going to reduce yield per cow. And we looked at this relationship, and we can see that there's no relationship whatsoever. And we have a big range of milking intervals, anything from farmers that have a 7-hour interval or a little bit before it, all the way to a 15-hour interval. And we have a massive range in terms of milk kgs per cow per day, and some really high output herds involved in this analysis. And we can see absolutely no relationship whatsoever here. So it's really telling us that if we want to change our milking interval, it doesn't come at a cost to milk kgs per cow per day. Another, I suppose, perception can be, I can't change my milking interval because I've just so much to do during the day that I couldn't possibly get all the work done. So I've no choice but to push out my evening milking and therefore have a longer milking interval. So we looked at the milk recording times here, the milking interval by season, because we know from previous studies, labour studies, that the busiest time of the year on spring calving herds is in springtime. And we would expect to see, I suppose, a reduction in the hours of work on the labour efficient farms kind of from midsummer onwards, particularly after the bulk of the breeding is over and done with. So with that in mind, you could expect that once your busiest seasons are over, that your milking interval should change. But here we're seeing that there's no change in milking interval throughout the seasons. So this really is indicating that the milking interval, which is really, I suppose, the time that you start in the morning to when the time you start milking again in the evening, isn't changing throughout the season. So it's a habit or a tradition. It would suggest that data would suggest a habit or tradition more so than a busy workload. And then when we look to see, in terms of the 2,366 farms that are involved here, what percentage are actually finished milking by 6 o'clock? And milking by and far, I suppose, on most farms outside of the calving season is the last task of the day. And from talking to employees, a lot will say, ideally, I would like to be out of the yard by 5:30 or 6, or in farmers themselves, just so that I can do other things for the rest of the evening. So when we broke it down by evening finish time, we can see that 23% of the total number of farms there were finished milking by 6 o'clock, okay, which is really positive. And we also know from the data set that there was 22 counties involved here, and that from every county there was a percentage of farmers finished by 6 o'clock, which is a great positive and shows that it can be done. But it also shows us that there's quite a big percentage that are milking later on into the evening, which, if you look over to the right in particular, after 7 o'clock, we can see 36% of the farms there were finished after 7 o'clock in the evening. Herd size is, I suppose, another, reason cited for, being finished early in the evening, because the perception is farmers with bigger scale will have full-time employees, and therefore that they can be finished earlier because they have more help on the farm. So we looked at herd size in relation to the different evening finish times, and on average we can see that they're slightly higher for the farmers that are finished earlier, but there's very little difference really on average, going from 134 cows to 106 cows. And when we look at the range in terms of the min and max here, we can see within all finished time categories, there's farmers with from 40 cows all the way up to over 500 cows. So really, we can't say from the data that herd size is, a factor in terms of evening finish time. It's not. It's across the board in terms of the farms that are finished earlier. So in summary, there's a massive difference in milking intervals across the farms that we looked on, and therefore a massive difference in finish times. Every county has farms that is achieving the 16 to 8 milking interval, so we know it can be done. There's a massive opportunity to reduce the milking interval in terms of shortening the working day for the farm owner, for the family, for the employees. And I suppose it's important to say it's not always about, being in the house or, off playing football or things like that. For some people, at certain times in the year, they may want to go back out again. That's perfectly fine. The most important job of the day is done. And it really does, I suppose, leave you with a choice. But more importantly, it also helps you to attract and retain people on your farm, which is key to your business. And in turn, it also gives greater, I suppose, time efficiency or labour efficiency to the farm when that milking interval is pulled back, and it may be a half an hour or maybe an hour on some farms. But I suppose it's commonly said from farmers who have changed their milking interval that they noticed that their efficiency, and I suppose that they're working smarter now because they have less time to get the tasks done, and they have no choice now but to be more efficient about it. So thanks very much for listening to my presentation today.